Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. Welcome to Super Review. Today we're going to take a look at the Moondrop Illumination, which, as you can tell, is an IEM. And this is an IEM that I've been interested in for quite a while now, and for a couple of reasons. So this actually came out late last year, but this was kind of like the first in what was like a quick succession, a quick series of pretty big name IEM releases that were single dynamic drivers, and that's not like super common in the premium space. So that's what the Illumination is. It's single dynamic driver, and I did mention it's premium space, which is to suggest that it's kind of expensive. In fact, these are quite a bit expensive. It's an $800 IEM, but you can see it's pretty attractive, and I was pretty interested to see, you know, do they live up to the price? Do they live up to the aesthetic? And do they live up to, and this is the other part of why I was excited about it, do they live up to Moondrop's reputation, right? So if you watched my, what did I call it, the earphone awards, there were 2, maybe even 3 Moondrop IEMs. I was really excited about that had come out last year. And this was one of them that I didn't get a chance to listen to until recently. So I have been listening to it for the past couple of weeks, honestly, comparing it to some other IEMs like this. I think the main competition, the things that we're going to talk about today, is I spent some time comparing this specifically to the Dunu Zen, which is another large single dynamic driver earphone, as well as Moondrop's own S8, which is kind of, up until this point, been my favorite IEM, at least my favorite that I've got. So yeah, that is what we'll be talking about, and like my other videos, this is a live stream, so if you have any questions, if you're watching live now, you've got a question about the Illumination that I don't get to, leave it in the chat, and at the end of the video, we'll spend some time just talking back and forth, engage with you guys in real time. And if you're watching the VOD and you missed out on the live stuff, that's fine. I forgive you. But if you don't want to miss out again, subscribe to the channel. You ding the YouTube bell so that YouTube will let you know that I'm going to be live. And then I guess we'll talk next time. But for now, let's dive into the Moondrop Illumination. And like I typically do, I'm gonna start and talk about sort of the build and the physical stuff, and honestly just what do you get inside the box. And I'm gonna go ahead and coil this thing up for presentational purposes, but there you go. So these are the things that you get inside the box. There are also a collection of tips that are still in here, but I didn't use those tips. And we'll talk a little bit more about that maybe when I talk about sound. But yeah, basically what you get in here is pretty typical for Moondrop's kind of premium priced headphones. You get the earphones itself, a nice cable. You get a carry case, which is pretty cool. It's a little bit on the thick side, and frankly, I didn't use it, but it is a very nicely built carry case. You get an airline adapter for all those flights you're taking as well, and this will lead us into talking about the cable a little bit. Unlike Moondrop's other IEMs, the Illumination comes with a cable that's got sort of swappable termination. So you basically, I believe, you just pull in this thing, and you've got sort of this unique 4-pin connector system that lets you swap between either a 3.5 millimeter connector, which is what I use, or they also supply a 2.5 millimeter balanced or 4.4 millimeter balanced. Now the cable that comes attached to is a pretty decent cable. You know, Moondrop honestly is kind of not known necessarily for their cables. They always have decent cables, and this I would say is a decent cable, but not necessarily a standout one. And you can kind of see that it's got a little bit of a memory problem. It's a little memory prone, but honestly I didn't have any issues with the cable. I think aesthetically it's handsome, apart from this end down here. Not necessarily the most handsome, but that's me being picky. And I think for an $800 IEM, you do get the luxury of being picky. You do have sort of a smaller Y split here than Moondrop typically provides, and I actually like that. But also, like what Moondrop typically does, there's no chin cinch, which is a little bit of a bummer. But this is an IEM that I didn't necessarily need a chin cinch for. You do have, of course, preformed ear hooks, and they are 2-pin connectors, like I think pretty much everything else Moondrop has. And now that's going to bring us to the buds, sort of the business end of this package. And I mean, just aesthetically, we'll start there. I think this is a very handsome IEM with one kind of problem. I don't know. it's just glossy, so you can tell that it's got my fingerprints on it right there, right? And so that's why I've got this thing right here, so we can wipe it clean and you can look at it in all of its glossy golden glory, which frankly is it's pretty handsome. Like, this is a color in pictures. I wasn't sure if I was gonna love it, but in reality, I think this is a really, really handsome IEM. The shells are actually on the small side, which I think this is probably gonna come across in the video, but these are tiny. These are really, really pretty compact. If you're familiar with something like the Moondrop Starfield, these are a smaller shell than that. And that carries through to the fit, which I'll do a quick fit demonstration to show it to you. I guess also worth calling out, not only are these buds pretty small, they're also made of some sort of like titanium alloy. So they're actually really lightweight as well. But you can see inside my ear, it fits pretty small and honestly fits, I would say, pretty great. It's pretty secure, I think more secure than something like the Starfield or the KXXS. Maybe not as secure as something like an Etymotic, but that's kind of on the extreme end. But another thing that kind of stands out about the fit of this IEM, comfort's great, but another thing that kind of stands out as you fit this and as I'm talking to you is that sound isolation is actually kind of on the I guess you could say poor side. It doesn't actually bother me personally. I think I talk about this all the time, like sound isolation, not really important for me when it comes to IEMs, but definitely worth knowing if you're looking for an IEM that's gonna, cut out the sound of being on a train or being on a bus or something like that. These are not gonna do it. These are surprisingly open. We can punch in here and I can kind of show you the construction. They've got this venting down here. They've got venting down here in the back. And I suspect that is all playing into the fact that this is just a very, very open sounding IEM. All right, so yeah, generally pretty happy with the build and the construction on it. I really do think it is a very attractive IEM. And fit for me and comfort is, I would say, outstanding, honestly. Really have no complaints about it. It's just worth knowing that there's not much isolation if that is important to you. And again, for me, not important, but totally worth calling out. But that's gonna lead us into talking about the sound signature of the Illumination, and generally just kind of like the top level tuning of this, I would describe as kind of a warm neutral. Neutral kind of has, someone says something is neutral, it kind of has a connotation of being a little bit boring, maybe a little bit bass light, and maybe a little bit clinical sounding, but I don't think that necessarily applies here to the Illumination. I think that you just generally get a very neutral sounding mid-range with a little bit of actually lower mid-range warmth. There's not a lot of bass emphasis here, but there is enough bass body to it that I don't think people are gonna find it bass lacking. And then the treble tuning I would describe as kind of on the polite side. It's not especially bright, especially forward treble, just kind of neutral, kind of warm neutral. So that's the general tuning and tonality of the Illumination. Let's go ahead and just kind of first start talking about what are the things that I like about this sound. So generally, I think this tuning honestly is really excellent. So I talked about there being two other single dynamic driver earphones that came out recently. I didn't name them. One of them was the Dunu Zen, and the other was the FiO FD5. Of those three IEMs, just purely on tonality, this one's my favorite. And this, I love the rich, sort of warm tune to it. Even, it's still somewhat neutral. I would still describe this again as neutral, but it's just not overly clinical. It's not especially thin sounding. I did kind of write down the note, it's neutral with benefits. It's just not an overly colored sound. In fact, it's not a colored sound at all. It just sounds really kind of naturally toned, a little bit rich and thick, versus something like the Moondrop Blessing 2, which I think is a little bit more on the thin kind of clinical sound. But yeah, generally pretty happy with that. The low end on the Illumination I think is pretty outstanding. Just especially like that whole lower mid-range into the bass, for my preferences, is kind of tuned just about right. So it's meaty, it's thick, it's textured, but it's not overbearing, and it doesn't ever come to the point where like the bass is clouding out the mid-range or muddying it up. And that's just about what I like. And then the last point on this too that I'll say that I really like about the Illumination is that it's really just a relaxing listen, zero fatigue. I had no issues with listening to these things for long periods of time, sleeping with them. You know, obviously it fits really well and flush, so that helps with sleeping, but also just the sound signature in general. The treble's not like overly shrill or piercing or anything at all like that. So if you're sensitive to treble, I don't think you're going to have issues here with the Illumination. Now, the things that maybe I don't love about the Illumination is, I think, just kind of broadly, definition on this IM is weak. I found the definition was a little bit lacking, which can have a couple of effects. So one, I think that staging and sort of specifically imaging and like the layering between sounds is not especially strong here. It does an okay job, and I think it does better than you know, something like, it's maybe about on par with like the Philo FD5, which is a little bit better than you would get in something like an Etymotic ER2, maybe, and also a little bit better than you would get on like a Starfield. But I don't think that it's really standout, and I feel like at $800, my expectations get pretty high in terms of that quality, in terms of that definition and that 3D effect. I think it's just okay here. And so I think also the Illumination just really is not that strong in terms of detail perception. And when we talk about, I say we, I'm not going to speak for other audio reviewers, but I think when a lot of people talk about detail perception in an earphone or a headphone, there is maybe the implication that it means there, you know, an earphone that's more detailed than another will actually show you details, and you'll hear things in one earphone that you won't hear in another. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. Like, I don't think the Illumination is lacking details that you will hear in other earphones using the same music. I just think they just don't stand out. And a lot of that has to do with, in my opinion, the just kind of lackluster definition on the Illumination. I found that, you know, treble attack was a little bit on the soft side. And I did find that just kind of generally the treble lacks bite. I mentioned it's polite, and for a lot of people maybe that's pretty important, but for me, I like a little bit of treble bite, and I just found it a little bit on the soft side here. And I did also find that with busy tracks, the mid-range, even though I really love the tuning of it, the mid-range can just kind of get a little bit on the smeared side. It just doesn't hold together as well as some more technical IEMs. And if you're looking for music that kind of demonstrates a thick lower mid-range, I think something like Drab Majesty, they've got a track called The Other Side. I mean, basically their whole album is pretty thick in the mid-range, but The Other Side is a good one to test. And so because of those side effects, I don't know. As much as I love the tune here on the Illumination, I just kind of found it really not that engaging. So that's going to lead us into talking about some head-to-head comparisons. Let me make some room to pull in the Dunu Zen. So this is an earphone I reviewed earlier this year. This is $700, which also is not cheap, but I guess it is a little bit cheaper than the Illumination. I consider these things pretty equal competitors in terms of price. And this is also a single dynamic driver earphone. I think between these two, I prefer the tuning generally of the Illumination. And I think I already talked about this being my favorite tuning of the 3 single dynamic driver earphones. So yeah, generally I prefer the tuning here. I think the tuning on the Zen is a little bit on the V side. Yeah, it's a little bit V. There's a little bit more lower bass and especially upper bass emphasis here on the Zen, which can give it like this meatier, kind of warmer thump to it. And then I think also the upper mid-range has a little bit more lift here on the Zen, which gives it kind of a stronger contrast between the upper mid-range and the lower mid-range, where here you kind of get a flatter, more neutral tune to the mid-range. This is a little bit more V-shaped in that sense. So yeah, tuning-wise, I would pick the Illumination for my personal preferences. I think they're both kind of similarly light on treble. You know, that was an issue that I brought up with the Zen, was I found it to be a tad on the dark side presenting wise, and I think that's kind of the case here. There's not a lot of air between these earphones. But the one thing that's really pretty different between these is the bass presentation. So not just is there more bass here on the Zen, The way that the Zen presents bass, I called it kind of a party trick. Like, it is really pretty standout and unique. It's really got just an awesome body to it, and an awesomely physical bass that, you know, I think the bass here on the Illumination is pretty solid. Didn't really have any complaints with the bass, but listening to it in head-to-head comparison with the Zen, just like the definition and the strength, the strength of the definition on the attack of bass hits is just super satisfying here. And here, it is what it is. So I find between these, I would say the Zen is a more engaging listen for me, despite the fact that tonally I would pick the Illumination. I think for my personal preferences, I would go with the engagement factor on the Zen. And so that'll bring us to our second comparison, which is Moondrop's own S8. So it's interesting that Moondrop has a couple of different IEMs in the same price range. The S8, I believe, is about $700, so $100 cheaper. But it is, you know, as you can probably tell, an all balanced armature set versus the single dynamic driver here. Now, there's going to be some people that just prefer dynamic drivers to balanced armature sets. And when I say some people, I mean, that's kind of a lot of people, honestly. But I personally, I don't mind the BA timbre that you get here. Now, there is definitely some BA timbre, and I think that timbre is one of the things that the Illumination excels at. And I know that that's kind of a wishy-washy term, timbre in general, but I think that when you listen to these things back to back, it's going to stand out to you that the Moondrop, the S8, is producing sound in a somewhat more clinical and less natural sounding way than the Illumination. And I think that's the dynamic driver versus the BAs. Now, the other big difference is in the tuning. I've described this as kind of a thick, warm, neutral. This is kind of a thin, I think it's fairly safe to call this a Harman tuning. It's got a fairly flat lower mid-range, very, you know, I would call it on the thin side, with some upper mid-range lift, and a bigger shelf in the lower bass specifically. The upper bass is a little bit tame here. So I think that you get a lot more body on the Illumination, but in exchange for that body here on the S8, in my opinion, you just get a lot stronger contrast and a lot stronger definition in the sounds, which is kind of what I talked about lacking here on the Illumination. So with that extra definition, I think you just get stronger detail perception here on the S8. I think staging and especially imaging quality is just mwah on the S8, whereas here it's okay, but I think it is pretty standout here. I think also just the treble quality on the S8 was one of the reasons I really love this earphone, and in head-to-head comparison, I think it's fairly obvious that the treble quality here on the S8 is just better. I mean, there's more of it, it's got better bite to it, but it's still very smooth, and it doesn't really come at the expense of fatigue in the way that you might expect if I described an earphone as having more treble. So yeah, my personal preferences between these two is very strongly for the S8, which maybe is not a surprise because this is my favorite earphone right now, but it is interesting that Moondrop's selling a couple of different earphones in the same price, roughly the same price, and this one, the older one, is actually the one that I personally prefer. So I think that's going to do it for my review of the Moondrop Illumination. Out of 5 stars, this one was kind of tough, but I'm going to go ahead and give it 3 stars. I think there's not a lot wrong with this earphone. Like, honestly, if you listen to this thing in isolation, it's going to be a very nice sounding earphone. I think, again, tuning wise, it's very solid. It just lacks that definition and that engagement factor that I personally kind of expect when the price goes as high as this. So I think at $800, it's a bit of a hard argument. If this is a cheaper IM, I think if you can find this cheaper, there's I think some pretty good reasons to go for it, but in the end, it's kind of how I felt about the Illumination. Now, if you're interested in checking this thing out, I do of course have a link in the description down below. Shout out to Shenzhen Audio for providing this for review. If you like this video, if you found this helpful, please hit the like button. It helps me out, helps other people find the content. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, etc., etc. And then I'll see you in the next super review. And for the folks that are here live, let's chat. All right, let me catch up with live chat as best as possible and hopefully answer some questions about the Illumination. Throw that aside, pull out the mouse and scroll. Start with the early shout outs. Ohm State, what's up? Nick the Chopper, nice to see you. Recode, how's it going? DNT Arc. Amar saying $800 is a lot, and I agree. $800 is a lot. Now, when it comes to an IEM like, all right, let's pull in this trio here. Obviously, no matter what, $800 is going to be a lot. But at $800, you're kind of looking for something that's a little bit special, right? It can't just be a decent sounding earphone. You might be looking for some combination of it sounds the way I want it to, plus it fits the way I want it to, plus maybe it looks a little bit extra special. I think all three of these kind of hit most of those targets. And sound-wise, like, again, this is pretty good, but it's just not really standout for the price. If this looks the way you want it to, and I can tell you it probably fits the way that you want it to, maybe you'll still be happy with it. But I think for $800, you know, the party trick of the bass here on the Zen is gonna feel more like you got your money's worth, and then the detail and the imaging quality and the treble quality of the S8, I think, is gonna make you feel like you got what you paid for. Whereas here in the Illumination, I don't know. It's a hard sell for me. $800. Asian Hat asking, whoa, did I make my own graph database? I did. Well, I mean, it's based on the same software that Critical uses. He built it with a developer. It's sort of as an open source project. And so I actually made a pull request and made an update to the software. But yeah, I ended up making up my own fork of it at squig.link. Zeke's asking any recommendations for an IM under $100. I think the most, I mean, there's a handful, and in fact, if you go to my channel, I have a playlist of my 5 favorite picks under $100. The most reasonable, honest answer I can give is the Etymotic ER2 XR. I think that is just how that's an earphone under $100. I don't really know, but it sounds excellent. I know a lot of people are turned off by the fit of the ER2, but I think you can get used to it. My Life Matters saying that, wow, it looks smaller than the S8. Yeah, I think size-wise, let's zoom in on these things. I mean, I can say in the ear, the Illumination definitely fits smaller than the S8. But yeah, you can see size-wise, this thing is itty-bitty. It's a really nice form factor, honestly. Especially if you're actually looking for an earphone that has that openness, because most earphones don't. I talked about that as a potential downside for some people, but I think the fact that there's so little isolation with the Illumination could also be a potential upside, depending on what you're looking for. Bradford was asking which tips are those? Are the earfoot lights? And yes, that's what I have on here. So I didn't talk about the tips like I said I was gonna. I tried a number of different tips on here, mostly just for measurement's sake. In fact, those are on squig.link if you want to see what changes the ear tips have to the frequency response. But basically, this is a loaner IM, so it came with a handful of tips that I think other people have used, and I just decided not to go down that route, and that's why I put on the earfoot lights. These were my own tips. I is asking, who are the people buying such expensive IMs? How many people actually buy IMs in this price range? That's a really interesting question. I have no idea like what the sales volume of any of this stuff is. That would be really interesting to know. I don't know if manufacturers or retailers would be willing to give up that information, but maybe I'll start asking around because I'm pretty curious to know also. I do know that, so Dunu recently came out with the EST112, and they posted like a picture of what looked like a pretty large shipment of them, and it sounds like they're already sold out of what they've made. So maybe there's quite a few people out there that are looking for just a high-end IM and don't mind the extra cost for it. Deepen is saying Moondrop's cables are pretty thin compared to others. Any idea why? No, I don't have any. Like, I haven't heard anything from Moondrop kind of explaining what their cable philosophy is or anything like that. No. I would say that this cable here on the Illumination, this is kind of similar, not too dissimilar from the cable that came on the The Audio Monarch, but I think the Monarch was a little bit on the thicker side, but is very similar in terms of texture and aesthetic. This one's, and you can also see, like, you're talking about the thinness. Here on the S8 cable, you can see that's, I think it stands out. The S8 cable is definitely on the thin side, whereas I would say the Illumination cable is not quite as thin as Moondrop thin. Recode is saying, I personally like the SSR cable more than the Illumination cable with side glance eyes. Yeah, I mean, the Moondrop SSR $40 IM still comes with like one of my favorite 2-pin cables. So I guess I'm not surprised to hear that. Metal, how's it going? Welcome to the chat. Rust is asking me, where did I get the blonde t-shirt? So asking about this shirt right here. Actually, I made it. If you're interested in checking out, I have a link in the description down below to the Super Review merch store. You can get yourself a blonde shirt or a Bloppity shirt. You can get yourself a high-res placebo shirt. You can get a high-res placebo pen. Ohm State is saying, bass and neutral, so like the Monarch and Claire twins. So I described the Illumination as kind of a meaty, low-end type of neutral, but I do think that this is pretty different from the neutral that you get on the Monarch. I haven't heard the Clairvoyance, so I can only describe the Monarch, but the Monarch to me is, tonally, it's actually probably closer to this, to the S8, where it's got a little bit of a thinness in the mid-range that this doesn't have. This is kind of like a warm, full mid-range. And then the bass on the Monarch is just really focused into that sub-bass frequency. So if you're listening to music that, you know, maybe it's just all about kick drums and doesn't have a ton of sub-bass, it might not even sound that necessarily bassy on the Monarch. But where was I going with this? I think, yeah, I guess the mid-range tuning on the Monarch is just a little bit more clinical and forward, whereas here on the Illumination, I would describe it as a little bit thicker in the mid-range. So fairly different, honestly. Poop, hello, Mr. Review. How's it going? Asian Hat, I see you're saying the new Aria is the KXXS killer as well as Starfields. We'll see about that. So I actually unboxed the Aria a few days ago, maybe almost a week ago, but I haven't actually had a chance to listen to it. I listened to it for like a song and I was like, yep, sounds pretty good. But I haven't been able to compare it to the Starfield, or I don't have the KXXS, I have the KXXX. But that's probably gonna be my weekend. It's gonna be evaluating that earphone. I'm trying to, I've kind of got a little personal schedule for myself. My goal is to do the review for the Aria on Monday. Hold me to it, otherwise I'm slacking. Now I've said it, I gotta do it. Faylee's saying, looks like this is Moondrop experimenting with a higher end DD. Hope we see more flagship single DDs in the future. Yeah, I think I think the single dynamic driver earphone market is underserved, and probably because it's difficult. That would be my guess. I've never obviously designed my own IM, but given the fact that there are so few high-end single dynamic driver earphones, my guess is that it's pretty hard to do. But I would still love to see more. Precog Vision saying, and he actually was over here this weekend listening to the Illumination. Fellow IM reviewer says, sounds more like the opposite flavor of the KXXS, I think. Upper mid-weeb tuning, talking about the Aria, which he also heard. Upper mid weeb for the KXXS and the Aria for warmer, bassier, smoother presentation. Yeah, I did graph the Aria as well as my Starfield and my KXXX. Again, I don't have the KXXS, but I graphed all three of them. They're available on squig.link if you want to check them out. But my Aria and my KXXX do graph a little bit warmer than my Starfield. My Starfield has slightly less bass and slightly more upper mid-range, whereas both the Aria and the KXXX kind of like in the opposite. So a little bit more bass and a little bit less upper mid-range. Whether or not I hear that, we'll find out. I haven't done that comparison yet. Don Trumpion saying, I knew that Zen made MRS love bass. Yeah, maybe this was the turning point. I don't know. I just honestly, this week, or yeah, I guess it was mostly yesterday, but the past couple of days, I went back to the Zen to remind myself and compare with the Illumination, and just really reminded how much I can love this earphone. There's some music that this is definitely not my favorite for, but if there's a kick drum, like I was listening to Smashing Pumpkins' album Gish, and the very first track on that album just starts out with awesome drum riff with a kick drum, and it's so satisfying here on the Zen. It was fine on the Illumination, but really back to back with the Zen, it was like, oh yeah, that's way more fun. And it's not like a smeary, messy, muddy bass. It's really nice and tight. So maybe my problem with bass is that I was only ever listening to budget IMs, and budget bass IMs kind of tend to be a little bit smeary. Mr. Heru saying, whoa, this is top of the line for Moondrop, still satisfied with SSP and Starfield. Do you have any plan on reviewing Type-C DACs? I don't think I'll be reviewing USB Type-C DACs just because they're all kind of the same. I mean, like the major differences are going to be the quality of the DAC, which is not like a thing I'm really in a position to discern. I mean, like I can listen to it and see if there's anything that stands out, but mostly I think they're all going to sound the same to me. I think the measurer, something like Audio Science Review, is probably going to give you a better view of like technical performance. The other slight difference is that like they'll have differences in terms of power output, but I don't know, you can read that on a spec sheet, I suppose. You don't really need me to review them. I don't know, if they get more interesting in terms of features, like if someone releases, I know X-Duo had a version of it, it just looked a little bit big, but if someone releases a small compact dongle, like Apple dongle sized, but it has like play and track skipping buttons built into it, I'd be pretty into that. The X-Duo version was appealing, but a little bit large. Someone can do an Apple size, I'd be into that. I don't know if I'm gonna do reviews though. Maybe I would do like a roundup or something. Oh, Kostruz is asking, saying, show us the box. So you want to see the Illumination box. Let's go ahead and, it's been here in view kind of the whole time. But yeah, take a look at this box. Very tall. I'll kind of give you the Star Wars scroll of the Illumination box. It's actually kind of cool. It's very tall. What do we have here in the back? We've got some specs again. Just do it like at an angle. Just punch in. Imagine Star Wars music. Imagine that's not out of focus and you can read it. There you go. There is the Illumination box. It's a very kind of cool presentation. Bring you guys back into view. Asian Hat asking, do multi-dynamic driver IEMs exist? They do, not to the extent that multi-BA IMs exist, but I think the original Tin Hi-Fi T2 is technically a dual driver earphone. I think the Galaxy Buds are actually an example of a dual driver IM. And I know there's more. There's actually KZ recently came out with like a triple dynamic driver earphone. So they are out there. Let's see, Metal is saying, it seems hard to justify $800 for any single DD, I think. Also, Krinsgraph makes me think it's less bassy and is shoutier than Starfield. This may be closer to a reference kind of sound than fun. I think that's right, yeah. I think, so I didn't compare this directly to Starfield and KXXS, but I think Starfield and KXXS are more, they're like kind of a V-shaped sound signature, which there's not a lot of treble emphasis on those, so I do feel a little weird describing them that way, but I do think that the mid-range, there's basically more upper bass emphasis, which kind of has the effect of that lower mid-range kind of taking a back seat and creating kind of a bit of a contrast. Whereas here with the Illumination, I feel like it's a bit fuller in the lower mid-range, but it doesn't then extend the same way into the bass the way that the KXXS and the Starfield do. Personally, I prefer the tuning on the Illumination. But that's a taste thing. Adam asking, how does it compare to the Blessing 2, considering it's a lot cheaper and has two versions? I personally prefer the Blessing 2. A lot of what I like about the mid-range here in the Illumination is kind of like similar to the Blessing 2, but I think the Blessing 2 does it a little bit better, a little bit closer to my preferences. It's not quite as full on the Blessing 2. And I think that the sub bass is maybe a little bit tighter, honestly, on the Blessing 2, and then the mid-range resolution is just that standout feature on the Blessing 2 that, again, resolution and definition not necessarily stand out on the Illumination. I think that the one place where I would definitely pick the Illumination over the Blessing 2 would be in sort of that, I think it's the lower treble. It can just get a little bit harsh on the Blessing 2, whereas really no issues with treble harshness here. But I think in terms of an overall engaging sound, I personally would pick the Blessing 2. Sub A saying hi, super review. Hopefully you're enjoying the warmer weather in the SF area. Yeah, today it's actually not that much warmer where I'm at. I don't know what happened. Like last week was phenomenal weather. Then we got to the weekend. It's a little bit overcast, and then it's just been overcast pretty much all week until today. Today is not overcast. It's nice, but it's still a little bit chilly. It's like 50, 55 degrees right now, Fahrenheit. Siddharth asking, when can we expect the Moondrop Aria review? I went over it a bit ago, and maybe I'm behind, but I'm planning for Monday. Hold me to that, maybe. Metal, you're saying Elysia spotted. So this back here is the Focal Elir. My buddy put on a set of, I believe they are Utopia ear pads. That's a pretty handsome headphone. I listened to the Elir, maybe like 4 or 5 months ago when he first got it with the stock ear pads. It's been long enough that I don't remember what the difference is, but initial impressions are, I like this quite a bit. Rob Hawk asking, how much do I think IMs are improving year over year? It's a tough question. I mean, like, you'll probably have noticed that over the past year, the IMs I'm reviewing in this channel have gotten more expensive. So in that sense, they just keep improving. Well, I mean, not that price necessarily equals sound quality, but fairly strong correlation between those. I don't know. Yeah, I don't think I'm comfortable saying that IMs keep getting better year over year. In fact, my favorite set is still the Moondrop S8, which I think came out in 2019. Late 2019, but 2019. What's up, Z-Pult? Welcome to the chat. And yes, shiny gold. What did you say about it? Fits the name. I agree. Illumination, I think, is a pretty fitting name for an IM that looks like this. Unfortunately, with fingerprints. Because I'm a human. Bradford asking, would I say in general the sacrifice in timbre and note weight is worth the upgrade in technicalities when going from DD to multi-BAs? For my personal preferences, yes. Although I know a lot of people are kind of allergic to the timbre trade-offs that you get with balanced armatures, I personally don't mind it. It's just a different type of sound that tends to come with stronger definition, stronger 3D effect, stronger positioning, and that's kind of what gets me mostly excited in audio. If you're looking just for like the most natural sounding something, it's definitely a trade-off. And I could see why someone might prefer a single dynamic driver or an open back headphone. Anmar asking, is it true that imaging in BAs is better than single dynamic driver? I mean, in my experience, that tends to be the pattern. That said, there are some single dynamics that have pretty strong imaging, and I would say like the most technical single DDs, ones that stand out at least at their price ranges, are the Moondrop SSR. I think in that sub $50 bracket, it's got really pretty impressive technical imaging performance. And that's a single dynamic driver. And then at around 200 bucks, there is the JVC FDX1, which I think is also a pretty impressive technical performance, and it's also a single dynamic driver. So I don't think it's necessarily the case that a balanced armature is always going to outperform it, but it does seem to be more common. Precog's take was imaging with BAs does tend to be better just because they tend to have better treble extension. Yeah, that's definitely a thing that, again, another pattern that seems to stand out. Not that all BAs have great treble extension, but if you're packing an IEM with 5+ drivers, it's easier to say, all right, this driver, you're just going to handle the extended treble, and that can have the effect of really improving the perception of definition and like attack on trebles, like cymbal strikes, or just honestly a lot of natural instruments, and even like analog synth will have kind of a little bit of a high frequency spike on the initial attack of the instrument. Just imagine you're hitting a drum that might have either a mid frequency or even a low frequency hit to it, but that initial strike of the drumstick on the drum is going to have a high frequency initial attack, and having extended treble is going to kind of give you that extra bit of definition. Audio Fool, how's it going? Welcome. DNT Arc saying, my favorite single DD IM is the Tin Hi-Fi T2 Plus. So actually very interested in the Aria since it looks like it's in similar tuning. Yeah, I wasn't thinking of doing that comparison, but now that you mention it, I think that is a comparison worth doing, because I think, I'm going to listen to the Aria versus the Starfield. That's, I think, the question that is on everyone's mind right now. But I actually might prefer the T2 Plus tune. I mean, I definitely prefer the tuning on the T2 Plus to the Starfield. And I should kind of put it in that mix because it's actually closer in price. Sam Z, do I think Chi-Fi has dominated the IM market? Any hope for Western companies? This kind of gets back to what we were talking about earlier. Like, I would love to see sales numbers. I have no idea what the volume is of all of these earphones. Like, I really have no idea. Zero idea. They could sell 100 units of every IM and I wouldn't be too surprised, or they could sell, 1 million units. I'd be like, all right, that seems like a reasonable range based on what I know, which is nothing. I guess if the question isn't necessarily about sales numbers and is just in terms of like what's performing well. I mean, I review a lot of Chi-Fi just because that's where things are moving quickly. Like the manufacturers are coming out with new earphones all the time, and they're very eager to have reviewers like me review them. Whereas, you know, a company like Sennheiser, they just release a new IM or two a year. And so they don't get as much, they don't show up as much on a channel like this. In terms of my preferences, I think it's all at this point kind of Chi-Fi. I mean, 64 Audio makes some really nice stuff if you're willing to spend that much money. I think Campfire has got some pretty decent options if you're willing to spend that much money. And then Etymotic, right? I talked about the ER2XR under $100. I don't think you can beat that. So I don't think it's all dominated by Chi-Fi, but I think the pace, like how quickly the Chi-Fi market moves, it just makes it so that at some point they're going to break through and they're going to have an IM like the Moondrop Blessing 2 that's just really hard for other things to compete against. And just kind of let that be a bit of a life lesson in terms of try a lot, all right? I'm not trying to get deep with you, but like try a lot. Don't try to, if, you know, just being successful in life, I think a lot of what can make a person successful is in success depending on how you define it. But it's just trying. Do what you want to do. And if it doesn't work out, that's cool. Try again. And you know, if you put all of your eggs into one basket and you only try something once a year, maybe it won't work out for you and you're only going to get one shot a year. If you can try more than once a year, if you can afford to try more than once a year, I think it's worth it. Wendigo, what are the best bass hammer IMs? Ooh. I would say, honestly, like there's probably two choices, like of things that I've heard. The The Audio Monarch, if you really just want a lot of sub bass, it's a lot of sub bass. And if you've got music that plays that sub bass, those sub bass frequencies, you're gonna get just an earful of it. Another option is actually the Dunu Zen. This is probably my favorite bass if I'm looking for a bassy IM. Yeah, and it's not even like, it's not, if you look at it graphed in the frequency response, like in terms of volume, it's not necessarily a load of bass, but it's the presentation and the quality and just the physicality of the bass on here is unlike anything in any other IM I've tried. Nicholas, favorite IM under 100 euros, Etymotic ER2XR if you can find it. Olivier is asking, IM recommendation for a user coming from the world of headphones, Focal Clear, and looking for the same type of sound characteristics. I don't know. I haven't heard the Focal Clear, and honestly, I have a difficult time really equating headphones to IMs. Like, it's going to be a pretty different sound. Even if you can go for something like, if you start with a neutral headphone and go to a neutral IM, it's still going to be a pretty different experience. So I have a hard time answering that question, honestly. But maybe, no, I'm not even going to try. I'm not going to try. Z-Pult saying, agree that Chi-Fi's iteration seems to be helping them get better faster, especially the last couple of months. Yep. Ricky, what's up? And Don saying, you got to rewatch the Zen review. The bass sounds killer. Yeah, I think I equated it to like Gorilla. Like it's got a physicality to it that's really, really unique and a lot of fun. But that's going to go ahead and do it for this video. I really appreciate y'all hanging around and chatting. I'll appreciate all the questions, asking me to see the box, etc., and the opportunity to provide some deep life advice, which wasn't that deep. But anyway, Thank you guys for watching. If you're interested, in more videos like this, of course, subscribe to the channel. But if you're not already, check out a link in the description below to my Discord server, where we chat about earphones, we chat about all kinds of things. We chat about turning your Android phones into dApps. We talk about a lot of stuff. And if you want to talk about that kind of stuff, join the Discord server. I'm there all week. But until the next video, I'll see you later. That didn't make any sense, but have a good one.